Before we get started with the content in this video, I want to address the elephant in the room. While the title of this video is Mechanical Fundamentals of PvP, the concepts in this video are honestly significantly more advanced than they may seem at first. Like many high skill ceiling games, the fundamentals themselves have layers, and it can be very hard to explain those layers. A lot of what I'll talk about is stuff that I've learned from my life playing multiple genres and different types of games that I've applied into V-Rising. It's honestly very difficult for me to go into deep detail to explain and elaborate on concepts that often fall under the game sense category, when so much of it comes from just playing the game and getting experience. Players who have spent a lot of time in PvP in this game tend to know a lot of this stuff intuitively and probably don't even realize when they're doing it. On the flip side, some of the stuff that experienced players see as intuitive, newer players don't even notice is actually happening. This creates a very large gap between each group because one side is like, what in the world is even happening? How did you even get this good? And the other side tends to only be able to think, I don't know, just play the game? That's how I got good? I say all of this because there will very likely be things that I forget to mention or don't address. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments or go to the description and get the link to my Discord. If you're on PC, you can also hop in V-Arena and ask players there. But anyway, for this video, we're going to be going over two major mechanical fundamentals. We visited mechanical fundamentals a bit in the past when we went over the importance of weapon swapping. The mechanical skill ceiling in this game is honestly astronomical. As an example, there are players who are very familiar and comfortable with weapon swapping that I'm able to beat using just a single weapon and off-meta spell setups. Simultaneously, there are people who can absolutely body me when I'm playing my best build, who force me to focus as much as possible just to be able to keep up and compete with them. That is the level of mechanics that are possible in this game. It all comes with practice, so stay consistent. Even just spending 30 minutes in V-Arena each time that you play will massively increase your muscle memory at an alarming rate. The thing is, building muscle memory is really only the beginning in this game. What starts as trying to remember which keys your weapons are on turns into trying to remember combos, which then progresses into having the freedom to mix up those combos to create very interesting openings, as well as being able to read your opponent and what they are trying to do to you. But enough of that. Let's get into some specifics. Let's talk about first the single biggest and easiest thing to work into your gameplay now that will give you massive improvement, which is veil attacks. This is arguably as important or more important than weapon swapping and is significantly easier to master and work into your gameplay. When I watch newer or even moderately experienced players, one of the single most common errors I see them making is not getting consistent value from their veil attacks. Most of the time, they see their veil as an uh-oh button or a gap closing button. They oftentimes just use it randomly for positioning or whenever they panic if they take too much damage. They don't realize that the 5% max HP heal it gives is probably the most important mechanic in all of PvP. To put this into perspective, if two players are fighting and have equal max HP of around 1000, and one player hits 10 more attacks or veil attacks than player 2, player 1 has effectively increased his max health by around 500 HP, which is enough to take 2 more static spear Qs. It also means that player 1 is keeping his effective max health up for way longer than player 2 is, so other sources of healing go much further. The longer you can keep your effective max HP high, the more likely you are to win a battle of attrition against the other player. Good veil attack management is one of the biggest reasons why experienced players are capable of gigantic comebacks or winning 1vx scenarios. And lucky for you, it's the single easiest thing to work into your gameplay. Instead of dodging for the sake of dodging, 95% of the time, you should be looking to both dodge an attack and land a follow-up primary. There are reasons to not do this, but if you're watching this video to get better, those reasons aren't really worth talking about in depth right now. But just as a quick example, there are things like using a veil attack and then faking it, and then following it up with an ability like Sword Q if you happen to bait out a counter. But again, for now, let's just ignore that, just to stick to the fundamentals. The most important thing to learn with Veil attacks is making sure you're using the correct weapon before using your Veil. This is a muscle memory thing that will also help you on the weapon swapping front. Generally, Spear is the overall best option for this because the primary attack is so fast, but Whip is also an extremely good option. There's also something to be said about learning to do this with things like pistols, as the range they give can be very helpful for learning spacing, but for now, let's just stick with Spear. When picking which Veil to use, unfortunately, not all Veils are created equally. While all of them heal you, each of them has its own unique jewel effects, as well as combos with other effects. Some Veils are also strictly better than others, which is very unfortunate. To start, let's go over the best Veil in the game, Veil of Chaos. The obvious reason for this is because you have 2 dashes. This means that you have an additional iframe, but it also means that you get 2 of the Veil bonuses that you get from your Dracula armor set. In the case of the Dracula Shadow set, it means that you get the boost of speed that it gives twice. Because of these 2 dashes, Veil of Chaos has innate advantages over single dash Veils. Remember how important I said Veil attack heals are? In general, when players are in a neutral position, meaning that they're across from each other with roughly equal cooldowns, the player who Veil attacks first is usually at a disadvantage. This is because if the player who Veils second times it correctly, they can avoid the Veil attack from the first attacker and then land their own. There's more to it than this, but this is just a very basic understanding. In the case of Veil of Chaos, however, you have 2 dashes before using the attack. When up against a single dash Veil, this means that the Veil of Chaos player can dash first, wait for the single dash Veil player to use their Veil to try to get the advantage, and then use their second dash to regain that timing advantage to land their own Veil attack. Remember whenever I said there were things that experienced players know that newer players don't even realize is in the game? This right here is one of them. When you first begin adjusting to your use of Veils and Veil attacks for PvP, I would honestly suggest picking up a single dash Veil over Veil of Chaos instead though. This will help you learn much faster when you should and shouldn't be using your Veil, as using the Veil incorrectly will very often result in you getting punished for it by a good player. With Veil of Chaos, you can kind of just throw out the first dash, a lot of times somewhat at random, and then recover from your misplay very easily by just dashing a second time and landing the primary attack. If you'd rather not have that extra layer of difficulty, just use Veil of Chaos because it really is that good. Does that mean that every other dash is bad though? No, not really. There are some extremely powerful effects on other Veils, like Veil of Frost, Veil of Storms, and Veil of Blood. Veil of Frost has huge damage jewel effects, has a freeze effect, and has shields to go on top of the heals you get. To me, Veil of Frost is easily the second best Veil in the game. Veil of Storms gives you attack speed for just using the Veil, and then has jewel effects that allows you to get an instant stun by veiling through an enemy to apply static, hitting them with the primary attack to consume the static, which stuns them, which sets things up like a spear Q as a true combo. Veil of Blood can get enormous heals, also inflicts a fading snare, and can also get a temporary damage boost that works extremely nice with things like Blood Rage. When it comes to the other 2 Veils, unfortunately, they tend to struggle. Veil of Illusion actually has some extremely powerful jewel effects, as well as a mind-bending recall ability if you recast it. Honestly, it's very strong in that regard because it keeps the enemy guessing whether or not you're going back or staying wherever you dashed. Unfortunately, however, the fact that it throws projectiles is a very big negative because those projectiles trigger counters and defensive abilities. This becomes an especially big problem in team play, where people are able to freeze or fear your allies because you did something as careless as using your Veil and the projectile triggered their counter. Veil of Bones is honestly just kind of sad. The skeleton warrior and mage that you summon is more often than not more harm than good in PvP because the enemy can use it to proc defensives as well as use it as something to heal off of with their own Veil. It does have a cool execute effect, but it simply isn't as good whenever you compare it to the other Veils because that execute effect does nothing whenever the enemy is at a high amount of HP. When using your Veil, you'll also quickly notice that enemies will do everything they can to deny you getting the primary attack off. You can very often get them to use a defensive ability just by using your Veil. Another simple but effective use of your Veil is to dash and then wait for the enemy to use a counter or Veil themselves and then hit them with good timing afterwards. This will feel very unintuitive at first because when you're first starting to learn PvP, combat feels extremely fast-paced, and doing this requires you to kind of slow down a little bit. Using a Veil in this way, however, will help you get the primary attack off much more consistently. We'll go into more depth on when and how to use your Veil effectively in the next video, but for now, this is enough information for you to start working on them. Once you've worked on your use of Veils and Veil attacks, it's time to move on to the next mechanical fundamental. Everyone's favorite topic, weapon swapping. If you're looking for the basics on weapon swapping, check out episode 2 in this series, which I'll link in the description. The most important thing when learning weapon swapping is developing muscle memory. There's no way around this. You have to put some kind of effort into learning it. So what's the best way to practice? Well, to start, you can head over to VArena and go to the practice area by typing in .tp4 and pressing enter in your chat bar. Use this area to learn the beginnings of weapon swapping by practicing on the target dummies. From there, you just need to jump in and find someone to duel. So find someone out there to duel and just start dueling. Most players I've met in VArena have been very chill, especially whenever you let them know that you're new or learning. They'll very likely give you tips and also tell you what you're doing wrong if you ask. And if they aren't really interested in dueling you, they'll usually just say GG and move on. Even practicing 30 minutes to an hour each day that you play will show noticeable improvement very quickly. There simply isn't a better place to learn this stuff. Open world combat is definitely different from VArena, but the difference is that VArena allows you to have multiple fights in a row with no downtime, where sometimes you can go hours, if not days, in open world without even getting a single fight. VArena crams dozens of fights in a very short period of time. If you're looking to practice an open world anyway, then commit to yourself that you won't shy away from a fight. If that means you get smashed over and over again, then so be it. If you're on PS5 and don't have any dueling servers like VArena, then just make a dueling arena in your castle and invite other players in the server over to come practice. You can also just set up practice dummies to work on those early weapon swap combos. Luckily for us, this will become significantly easier in the 1.1 patch because we'll be able to make our own dueling arenas. As you learn weapon swapping, you'll get access to more and more tools in your arsenal from all of the different abilities on each of the different weapons. These are the core functions that we mentioned in the previous weapon swapping video, which are CC or combo starters, poke, engaging or repositioning tools, knockback or get off me tools, interrupt abilities, or iframes. The more familiar you are with the ranges, timings, combos, and spacings of these abilities, the better that you can predict and play around what the enemy is doing. It also lets you do more advanced things like conditioning the enemy, or finding their habits and exploiting them, but again, that's going to be a topic for the next video. Learning weapon swapping not only gives you insight into what you are capable of, but also gives you huge insights into what the enemy is capable of. When newer players see fights between experienced players, one of the most common complaints that I've seen from those newer players is that it looks like the veterans are just spamming their abilities on cooldown with whatever weapon they happen to be using. And because of this, it can seem impossible to know what's coming from the other player. The more you play this game, however, the more you learn that this is just not the case at all for a lot of reasons. One reason is actually due to the concept of builds that's in the game. Currently, there are only 8 hotbar slots, but 11 weapons to choose from. On top of this, certain weapons are extremely important for PvP, so you can expect to see them run by a majority of players. Spear, Pistols, slashers, whip, and some kind of ranged weapon like a crossbow or longbow are extremely common and standard choices in the current meta. We then generally see a choice between greatsword or mace for some kind of gap closing ability with a big nuke on the Q. Usually greatsword is the most common here, but sometimes you'll actually just see both of them. This already accounts for 6 of the 8 slots, so there's really only 2 more slots to fill with a bunch of different weapons. Sometimes you'll come across someone who entirely forgoes one or more of the weapons that I just mentioned, but when they do, they're generally hindering themselves in some way. As an example, I've recently dropped whip because I realized I was relying on it just way too much because it's just such a strong weapon. It was giving me some very bad habits, but by not using it, I'm missing out on a suite of incredibly strong abilities across the board on the whole weapon. But regardless, that's just a choice I'm making to try to get better. Then when you look at why these weapons were chosen, you see that they try and cover as many of those core functions as possible. You have a long range weapon, 1 or 2 mid-range weapons, and then a bunch of close range weapons with damage, knockbacks, CC, or iframes. With this concept in mind, you quickly understand that randomly spamming abilities with whatever weapon you happen to be using doesn't actually make any sense at all. And rather, when you're at a long range, you can expect to see something like a crossbow or a longbow come out to try to poke at you, or maybe a greatsword or mace Q to try to gap close. When you're at a mid-range, you can expect to see things like poke from pistols or a whip primary, maybe another gap close from the mace or the greatsword, or a combo starter from like whip E or axe E within that range. When you're in a close range, while there are a lot of close ranged options to choose from, you've already massively narrowed down what tools the enemy should reasonably be using in this scenario. We know we likely won't see a long ranged weapon or a mid-ranged weapon because poking is just not a thing anymore because we're at close range. Gap closing also doesn't make any sense here because again, we're basically touching each other. That leaves combo starters like CC from like whip E or slasher E, knockback tools or disengage, and or iframes. As you fight someone, you'll eventually learn to make a note of what weapons they're using in those close range scenarios, and you won't be surprised to see them anymore. The more experienced you get, the more you will learn how to react to, predict, or prevent these things from hitting you. You'll also learn what the enemy is capable of because you'll understand what you are capable of. We talked about this in the weapon swapping video, but just a brief recap of what a good place to start is for weapon swapping. Try to start with 4 weapons at least, then try to think about them in terms of weapon pairs that complement each other. You also want to try to cover as many core functions for weapons and weapon abilities as you can. This will simultaneously train your muscle memory in swapping between weapons, but also help you to think about each weapon and their abilities as tools in your arsenal. There's a few good combos of weapons to start with, but as an example, here are 2 different weapon setups that will cover a lot of bases and also give you a very good foundation in learning core functions of weapons. First, let's talk about the original weapon setup I mentioned: greatsword, whip, spear, slashers. This is a very strong setup that covers a lot of bases. Greatsword has really good damage and a gap close on the Q, also has an iframe on the E. Whip is extremely strong in mid-range for its primary attack, has a very solid knockback on the Q, and extremely good CC on the E. Spear is arguably the most important weapon to learn due to the primary attack for veil attacks, which come out way faster than the other primary attacks of other weapons and has a very good range. Also, Spear Q is generally the best combo finisher in the game after you land some kind of CC on the enemy. Finally, slashers are excellent because the Q is another iframe with some mobility options, and E is a very strong ability for both CC as well as engage and disengage due to the large movement speed that it gives you. This overall is a very solid setup for learning weapon swapping, as it covers a lot of functions and also is very good overall for PvP, as each of these weapons are powerful in multiple ways. Another option for us starting 4 weapons will cover similar functions as the first setup, but will also help develop your weapon skill uses more, as well as help you learn the fundamentals of spacing, movement, and cooldown usage much better than the first setup. These weapons are mace, pistols, slasher, and spear. We already went over slashers and spear and why they're good, so let's talk about mace and pistols. Mace is one of the best weapons for learning PvP in the game in general because it has very big strengths and very obvious weaknesses. First, let's talk about E. Mace E is one of the best abilities in the game. It comes out extremely quickly, and the Incapacitate sets up combos. It also has a huge range, making it one of the best get off me tools in the game. By get off me, I mean that it helps to literally get enemies off of you when they get too close. This helps interrupt the enemy's tempo and momentum and can instantly swing that momentum back into your favor. Next, let's talk about the Q. It hits hard and is a gap closer, but in general, it's much easier to react to compared to Greatsword Q. You could do movement mix-ups with it to bait out defensives, but in general, if you use Mace Q at a bad time, chances are you're going to get punished for it. While this idea means that Mace Q is generally not as consistent as Greatsword Q, it also means that you are more likely to get punished quote-unquote correctly for using it at the wrong time. If you just throw out weapon skills at random while the enemy has cooldowns up, you will get punished by any good player. By using Mace Q, you will learn much faster when the right time is to use those abilities compared to Greatsword Q, which can be very difficult to react to, and sometimes you just get free hits off. Essentially, you're slightly hindering yourself and in return, gaining very valuable game sense. Next, let's talk about pistols. Their range is slightly longer than Whip, but the damage is lower and consistency on that first shot is simply just not as good as Whip. They are, however, very strong for approaching the enemy if you use that first shot to zone or approach, and then use the next two shots that come out much faster for harass. For weapon abilities, first let's talk about Q. Don't use it in PvP. It's probably the worst ability in the game for PvP because the channel time is super long and each of the hits can be countered or blocked with a barrier. The enemy can also kind of just walk out of it or veil out of it, and you're stuck in place while it's going off. So seriously, don't use it for PvP. The biggest reason to use pistols is the E. Pistol E is an iframe that effectively functions as a second veil in a lot of ways. Unlike the iframe on Greatsword E, which has an extremely slow and predictable movement, which leaves you open to easy punishes, Pistol E gives you a lot more freedom when you use it, as you can control which direction you dash. This is extremely powerful in general, but is significantly better when you use it to get out of currently the strongest ult in the game, Merciless Charge. Pistol E is one of the most important abilities to work into your gameplay, whereas Greatsword E is almost always strictly worse. And finally, let's talk about the comparison between Whip and pistols. We talked already how Mace will help you learn more game sense compared to Greatsword a little bit due to being punished quote-unquote correctly, so to speak. This idea is magnified like 10 times or more when comparing Whip to pistols. Whip is currently just obscenely overpowered. The primary attack comes out way too fast, it hits way too far, does way too much damage, and is virtually impossible to miss because it's a point and click melee attack that is almost like a hit scan ability in this game. It also has roughly the same range as pistols. This makes it one of the best weapons for veil attacks, only slightly losing out to Spear due to Spear's speed, but honestly, Whip is still just crazy for its primary attacks. Even if someone counters you, unless they're running Discharge, nothing will happen to you if you primary attack on top of their counter. This alone lets you get away with just spamming Whip all the time. The Q is an extremely good ability for movement and gap closing or knockbacks with huge range, and somehow is actually the worst ability on the weapon, if you can even call it that. Though E comes out extremely fast, has ridiculous range, and true combos into Spear Q and other abilities. And because of that amount of threat, it's also the ultimate bait for baiting out defensive abilities by just using cancel action. You can almost never go wrong using the Whip. Because it's that strong, Whip is both a very good weapon to use, but also a very bad weapon to use when learning PvP, in my opinion. Like that Greatsword Q versus Mace Q, but 100 times worse, you will very likely not get punished correctly when using Whip because it's simply so good. The result here is that many players end up using the Whip as a crutch, never really learning or dramatically increasing the time it takes them to learn good spacing and when the right time is to attack because they just get too much free damage all the time, which causes them to default to using Whip because it's worked so much for them in the past. And then all they can think about is, hey, can I hit them with Whip? Okay, I'm going to swap to Whip. Cool, maybe I'm going to Whip them, and then I'm going to Whip E them. Cool, I'm going to then Whip Q them. It's a problem. Pistols, on the other hand, simply don't have this type of problem. It probably sounds weird that I'm suggesting not to use the best weapon in the game, but it really can be a hindrance in a lot of ways whenever you're trying to get better at PvP at first. If you want to use it though, I don't really blame you because at a high level, it's still very much used by the vast majority of players. But to me, I think working on mini fundamentals early on is the better option. Okay. To wrap this video up, let's talk about one final thing with weapon swapping, but from the spell side. When you're first learning weapon swapping, it's generally a good idea to stick to abilities like the ones we mentioned in episode 1. Things like counters or other defensive abilities, and then a steroid. These things are very easy to get value with, and you don't really have to think whenever you press the button in a lot of ways. When you get better at weapon swapping though, it allows you to have more leeway in what spells you choose, and you can actually pick some more off-meta spells if you want. As you learn to maximize the use of every tool your weapons have, your weapons start to cover the holes that you have by picking offensive spells versus these other current meta spells in the defensives and the steroids. Generally, you have to think a little bit different when running offensive spells versus defensive spells and steroids, but that is where the next video will come into play. You'll also get much better with weapon swapping the more you learn other PvP fundamentals, but the journey begins here with weapon swapping. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, feel free to like and subscribe because there's going to be another part to this. But for now, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.